Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of In Lay Terms. Um, I'm very fortunate to have Mr. Professor Salim Mansur back on my show for a third part of this trilogy. It's a wrap up. Professor Mansour, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure.
How are you coping with the heat wave in Ontario?
It's tough. I mean, we got the cooling system going, but I just came from outside. I had to go and do some things, and it was like I was perspiring to the extent that I'd come out of a shower.
It's what they always say. It's not the heat; it's the humidity.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. The temperature is around about 31, um, but it is the humidity. Yeah,
Yeah, I used to go to Las Vegas with my family. It's a lot hard. It's much hotter than 31. It's, I don't know, 37, but it's dry.
it's
It's
dry. Yeah,
it's different. You don't sweat as much.
exactly. Yeah.
Professor Mansour, let me set up this episode. In the first one, we kind of went over the Israel-Gaza situations, and we framed it as Canada's interests. What should it be as a traditional peacekeeper? Last episode, the second one, we focused more on Ukraine, but also, what is Canada's interest in that? Today, in wrapping up this three parts series, is I want to bring everything together. What's going on? What's behind these wars? Like I believe, and I think you might believe this as well. Like these are not just random, unrelated conflicts. There's a grand strategy, grand plan. Whether they've mapped it out by intent or just happenstance. So let's start with, why don't I hand it over to you? Before we went live, you were talking about the conflict between the global south and the global north and the Western nations, raping and pillaging, and now might be going in reverse. So what's going on?
A lot is going on, Payman. A lot. And I suppose more will be going on, more will be happening. But if you go by the mainstream media, each is, as you said, random or separate, discrete, separate, So what has the Gaza genocide, the war in West Asia, Lebanon, Syria, and then the war that broke out last month in June with Iran, Israel and Iran, United States and Iran. What has that got to do with Ukraine? That is one possible question. Most people will be dismissive of it because they see these as separate issues and in separate parts of the world, even though in the larger context they are very proximate, very close. Or the thing that are ratcheting up in the West Pacific, that is Taiwan, China. You know, there are ongoing conflicts in Africa, especially in the Sahel region. That is, quote unquote, used to be called Black Africa, distinct from North Africa, and the heavy footprint of France as an empire, and of course in Latin America also there are a great deal of tension right now between Washington. There's a Trump administration in Brazil. If people are following that or paying attention to that, on the question of tariff and slamming tariff on Brazil recently, 50% that Trump announced. And with, of course, Cuba ongoing tensions and rising tension with countries like Colombia. Trump's attacking the BRICS nation by name, calling them, and dismissing them as just so many puny chihuahua, you know, yapping at America or the West, collective West. So these can be all seen as the mainstream media presents in North America or even in Western Europe or Europe as separate issues, but they're not separate issues. Um, They're convergent, and they are part of a struggle that has uh, broken out or was simmering, and now it is completely in the open. That is the Great Transition. I mean, the World Economic Forum was talking about the Great Reset. That is the reset that the oligarchs in the collective West want to bring about in economic relations with the rest of the world and the one world government that they want to impose. And the global South um, that was simmering, that nobody paid attention to because it was at first a small number of countries. And then with the Ukraine war, it has come into focus because of Russia taking a position with a special military operation that was a pushback, a massive pushback to the expansion of NATO countries or NATO into East Europe, right up to the borders of Russia, formerly Soviet Union, and same ratcheting up of tension with China or Taiwan. In a sort of for the United States, and sort of a reversal of what was signed and agreed upon by President Nixon and the late Mao Zedong in 1972, that normalized the relationship between Communist China or People's Republic of China and the United States. And that was passed through the Congress, and now through the period from the early 2000s, the Americans have been backtracking on those agreements to the extent now that Trump's argument of pivoting towards West Asia is accompanied by threats that America will not only support Taiwan, but America will possibly go to war with China, just as they have gone to war with Russia. So you see, there's a convergence taking place of all of these things. And of course, West Asia, that is what we want to begin with. So we can address them individually, right? I mean, we talk about West Asia, that is the Iran war, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Syria right now. Syria has basically been demolished, the Syria that came into existence after World War One, and what it is all about. But it is linked to directly with the transition, the global transition that is being spearheaded by the BRICS countries, and the leadership of the BRIC countries are with Russia, China, India, Brazil, Iran, and so there is, to put it in a sort of a relationship, there is the American hegemony or the American empire or America-led empire that came into being after 1945 under the tutelage in a small ways than we can cover in our conversation, but I'll make suggestions and hints of Britain. Even as Britain was fading away as physically an empire, the power and influence of Britain within this Anglo-American relationship, connected by the City of London, the banking capital during the British Empire, and it still remains the most important banking capital alongside Wall Street, that grew in importance in the 20th century, and particularly after 1945. So it is the synergy, the fusion of the banking interests in the City of London, the Rothschild bankers, and the Wall Street bankers, the Rockefellers, the J.P. Morgans, and their subsidiaries, and that uh, have come together, or came together, and basically ran the world economy from 1945 to right now. And what is happening is, at the end of the day, at the end of all analysis, um, we need to keep in mind that wars are bankers' wars. If wars are not financed, and if war is not profitable, then there would be no war. So wars are bankers' war. All wars are bankers' war. And there is a vast important literature about this. However, they're not discussed in the mainstream media. They're not taught properly in the universities and colleges, because what is taught in the universities and colleges are a varnished story, a story that is cut and paste, that removes the central issues of who controls, or how, who controls the wealth of the world. So that's the underlying factor. So let me take just a few minutes to put that axiomatic position, because nobody can understand what one would be talking about if you're just simply looking at, two countries at war, or two people at war, and then you say, well, they're the bad guys and we're the good guys. Oh, reverse, the bad guys and the good guys. And that's what the media presents it at. And for the last 80 years, since the end of 1945, the bad guys are always the guys who question and resist the good guys. And the good guys is us, the collective West. The bad guys are Chinese and Iranians and Indians and Africans. Why? Because they're trying to upset the arrangement, hence the status quo. So if you pull back, if you pull back and take a wide angle look instead of a narrow look, the difference between the camera shutters is, if you're taking a wide angle look at the scene that you're trying to photograph, or you're taking a portrait of just one person or a couple of person, right? And there is a vast difference between those two settings. So the wide angle look takes us back in time. Everything is, in that sense, historical. And in a nutshell, for the last 500 years, from 1492, this is the historian's way of marking the brackets, setting up the brackets from 1492. What was 1492? The Columbus's voyage of discovery. He was not alone. There were many others, but most famously Columbus is known. There was Vasco da Gama, there was Magellan, um, Ferdinand Magellan, and other navigators that were trying to find a passage to the east, that is to India and to the islands, the Spice Islands. They were called passage to the east, that would not go through the Middle East. The Middle East had fallen into the control of the Arabs, the Persians, and the Turks, and they had all, come together. That was the making of the Islamic civilization. So, going to find a route to the east, they headed out west, and in the process, they call it the discovery. They discovered America, as if America was an empty space. But from the European point of view, it is a discovery. It's an empty space, and they're going to now settle it, colonize it, and so on and so forth. So the history of the modern age begins with 1492, and the end of that bracket, the closure of the bracket, is again 500 years later, 1992. 1992, what was 1992 all about? The end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the collective West, this time under the hegemony of the United States, was the only power, in the world. There was no one, at least from the point of view of Washington and London, there was no power, no more Moscow. Beijing had been tamed down, America had come to terms with it. So Beijing was not a threat. And none of the other countries of the global south, posed a threat economically, militarily, technologically to the power of Washington, allied with Britain, France, Germany, etc. So that was the 500 years. Well, since 1992 to where we are in 2025, slowly, incrementally, the people of the global south began talking about their place in the world. They were civilizations. These are not simply states. Yeah, they were colonized, and maps were drawn, like in the Middle East. After World War One, the maps were drawn without asking the people. They were imposed by the Allied powers. But after 1992, people in the global south, including Russia, including China, began saying, what is our place in this unipolar world? Are we supposed to be and remain the serf in servitude to America, to the West? Or do we have our own civilizational history and we need to go back and claim our history? And so the argument, it becomes what is called multipolar world. It will not be one center. It will not be simply Eurocentric. That was a term coined in the 1970s by an Egyptian economist of, again, in the global south of great repute. He's dead and gone now, but his name was Samir Amin. By the way, I gave the name Samir to my son in respect of Samir Amin because I was studying Samir Amin. So he coined the word Eurocentric. And the Eurocentric age was over from the point of view of the global south. And so people began discussing it. But the question is, how do you, from the level of discussion and exchange of ideas to the level of implementation, because you're not talking about one country, you're talking about multipolar world and many countries in a global south where more than 2/3 of the world population is. More than 2/3 of the world population, 75% of the world population is in the global south. I mean, take India and China together. These two countries together have a population over 3 billion people in a global population of 8 billion people, right? So the global population plus the global resources. As I pointed out in our last conversation, that if you take the 10 richest country in the world in terms of natural resources, then of those 10 countries, only 3 countries are in the global north or connected with the global north. That is the United States, Canada, and Australia. 7 countries are global south. The richest country among the world, in the world, from resource point of view, is Russia. Iran is number 5, I believe. Iraq, number 6 or 7. Venezuela, Brazil, etc. So these people were talking about that. And then came the war in Ukraine. I don't think I have to go into the details of how it came about. It came about with the push by the American presidents and the Congress to bring in all the European countries into NATO when at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, or leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1990, 1991, the leaders of the collective West, the most important countries of the collective West, United States, Great Britain, France, and of course it divided Germany, but Germany was a powerhouse, and it still, in some sense, remains a powerhouse of Europe. Their leaders In United States, it was in 1991 or 1990, sorry, 1990, 1991. The president was George W. Herbert Walker Bush, or Bush 41, who had been the vice president with Ronald Reagan. The prime minister of Great Britain at that time was no longer Maggie Thatcher, but John Majors, who had succeeded Maggie Thatcher. The president of France was Francois Mitterrand, again, one of the very notable French leaders after de Gaulle. And the chancellor of Germany was Helmut Kohl, another, in a sense, towering German chancellor and statesman post 1945. And each one of them, in meeting with Gorbachev, individually and together as the G5 countries or G7 countries and the leaders of NATO, assured Gorbachev that there will be no extension of NATO eastward towards former Soviet Union. And it was on that condition that Gorbachev agreed to pull the Soviet army out of Germany so that peacefully East and West Germany could come together. You see? And then, lo and behold, what happens? A few years after that, 1994, 95, when Clinton becomes the president, begins the enrollment of East European countries, beginning with Poland, into NATO.
Can I jump in? I had a question and it ties into that. So this
Yeah,
expansion
go
of
ahead.
NATO,
Yeah,
and I agree with you. There's almost no integrity in the West. Nobody believes, especially after what happened with Iran and the surprise attack in the middle of peace
yeah,
negotiations. Um, Ukraine is kind of like the last straw that broke Russia's back.
camel's backs. Yeah,
It was a red line, and America's trying to cross it. I wanted to get your opinion on a belief that I have. I think Ukraine was not as serious as Iran. Ukraine was about trying to tame Russia, maybe take it over, topple it, which it didn't, it backfired. Whereas Iran, it's a route for Russian oil and energy north south and Chinese trade routes east west. And I think Iran is ironically at the heart of the BRICS system. What are your views of that?
yes and no. Yes and no. Ukraine is a different country than is Iran. I mean, in real estate, people talk about location, 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 in terms of price or value of a real estate. So, yes, I mean, um, Ukraine is an East European country, and its history, its people, its culture, its values are much different, if not radically different, as a Christian country, uh, half Orthodox, half Catholic, from Iran. Iran is a Middle Eastern country, and unlike Ukraine, has a 4,000 plus year history of continuity. You know, Iran was an empire, the Persian Empire, when Alexander the Great was not born. Iran is a country that had relationship going back, to 1000 BC and thereafter, with what is now Palestine or Israel, or what was in biblical term the land of Canaan, and then Judea and Samaria, and so on and so forth. You know, so this is a completely different in historically. It's like China. That's why I said, civilizational state. China is a civilizational state, a continuity of almost 5,000 years. India is a civilizational state. The Arabs are civilizational state. But Ukraine is not. Ukraine was a rump country, rump outpost. The very term Ukraine means a frontier land between empires. The empire was the Tsarist Empire that emerged, in 1100, 1200 AD, slowly, and expanded across 9, 10 time zone. And on the other side of this little piece of rump was the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, Europe, and so on and so forth. So Ukraine was artificially created by adding on territories, first by the Russian czars, most notably Catherine the Great in the 18th century, and then under the Bolshevik leadership after the 1917 revolution. For instance, Crimea, about which there is a lot of noise in the West, was added to Ukraine by Khrushchev, who was a Ukrainian, or Ukrainian mean he was a Russian born in what became Ukraine. I mean, Solzhenitsyn's famous book about 200 years relationship between Russians and the people who were not Russians but who came into the Russian Empire, focused on what is Ukraine, is about this fusion that took place, and then Ukraine becomes a part of the federation. Soviet Union was a federation, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So Azerbaijan was a socialist republic within Soviet Union. So was Kazakhstan, so was Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Belarusia, etc., right? So those boundaries were drawn by Moscow after 1917. Now, when Soviet Union collapsed in 1998, those boundaries that were the handiwork of the communist leadership did not change. They allowed these individual republics, that was a federation. To take an example, United States, Texas was joined to the republic in the 19th century. New Mexico was conquered from the Mexican Empire. California was joined. Alaska was given to America or United States by the Russians, in the 1860s. So these were all that were added on, and today America is a 50-state republic. It began as a 13 colonies, remember, in 1776. So, Ukraine, the contemporary borders, the borders before the February 2022 special military operation, was a border that was demarcated by Moscow, the capital of the former Soviet Union. It's still the capital, but it's the capital, again, Russian Federation. So there are other states and provinces within Russia that can claim to be independent, like Chechnya, but Chechnya is part of Russian Federation, you see. So whatever was built in Ukraine has the Russian imprint on it. That's not the case with Iran, you see. Iran is a civilization state with its own history, its own presence, but it fell under the influence and power in the 19th century of the Europeans, particularly Britain. That Britain came to control the southern half of Iran, and the Russian Empire before the Bolsheviks, that is in the 19th century, second half of the 19th century, the Russians controlled or had influence in the area around the Caspian Sea, you see. That's why when the revolution happened in 1917, the Azeris were separated from Iran. Remember, half the Iranian population, or more than half, or thereabouts, are Azeris. Ayatollah Khamenei is an Azeri, isn't he? Tabriz is in the Azerian province of Iran. So yes, your point is well taken. And as I said, yes and no, because of the differences. But this modern Iran, the Iran that emerges after Second World War with its boundaries, because the Europeans made the boundaries of the rest of West Asia, Iraq, and the boundary of Iraq between Iran was demarcated around the Euphrates and around the north of the Persian Gulf, Kuwait and so on and so forth, which got entrapped in the conflict during the Iran-Iraq War of 1980s. So yes, in that sense, it is so. But all of these boundaries are boundaries that were not part of the empire, that was a boundary that was demarcated by Western power, as in all of Africa, as in all of Latin America. You see? Now, subsequently, the people, as in India, for instance, where I was born, the boundaries were created by the British. All these countries, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, they were all separated out from the body of the Indian subcontinent. Same thing happened in Indochina. Vietnam was demarcated, Laos was demarcated, Cambodia was demarcated, Thailand was demarcated, and so on and so forth, because they had the power. But coming back to the main theme, I'm saying is that after 1992 began the effort to rethink what is going to be our position in the world. We were represented, that the global south was represented in the United Nations, whether it is Nigeria, whether it is Kenya, whether it's Sri Lanka, whether it's Iran, etc., etc., etc. But within these countries, there were problems because the boundaries did not reflect the organic emergence of these countries. They were simply carved out on a map by the European powers. So, for instance, in the 1960s, Nigeria went through a civil war between Biafra, that wanted to separate from Nigeria, the map that was drawn by the British, and the Biafran secession was defeated, and so on and so forth. There are other places that happened. A country like Rhodesia, you ask yourself, where does this name Rhodesia come from? It came from Cecil Rhodes, the great banker in England, 19th century, who gave his own name to a country. So these are the
That's a little
untold.
arrogant, yeah.
Was that
It's a little bit arrogant.
a little bit arrogant? More than arrogant, because it's a question of, in the 19th century, the question of, you know, who is a superior race and who is an inferior race, and all the people of the global south are inferior race.
Professor Mansour, before you proceed, we have some questions or points brought up by the audience
Yeah,
related to
please,
what you're talking about.
please.
I've often wondered about this. Sue Kellen Dyer says that Europe wanted the USSR gone, and then they created the European Union. She says it's laughable. It, it does seem like you get rid of one boogeyman, and then you create almost the same thing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, without the bankers in city of London and in Wall Street. Again, this is a history that some people might know, your questioner might know, or have some sense of it, but the vast majority of the people, 90+% of the people, have no knowledge about it. That it is the bankers in Wall Street and city of London finance the Bolsheviks to lead a revolution that is to break up the Tsarist empire. And that's what happened, because Russia got embroiled in World War One, and as the war continued into third year and fourth year, Russia was basically exhausted, because Russia was not an industrialized economy at that time. It was beginning its industrialization. It was basically a peasant economy, an agricultural economy, where Germany was the great power on in Europe, which was the industrial economy. In fact, the greatest industrial economy at that time in Europe. And that's why the war was used to prevent Germany from becoming the dominant power by both Britain, that's the city of London, which brought America into the war, that's Wall Street. And then they financed the people in Russia, particularly the Russian Jews, because it is the Jewish intellectuals that were at the heart of this whole Marxist movement, Marxist-Leninist movement. You know, Russia was a Christian country, and They succeeded. But then Russia went through an internal civil war in which the very people who spearheaded the defeat of the Tsarist Russia were themselves defeated. For instance, the man Trotsky, who was supposed to be the successor of Lenin, he went from New York. He was born in Odessa in Ukraine, but had come to America. And then he was financed to go back to Russia to lead and be participant in the uprising. And he did. He became the commissar in the Red Army, commander of the Red Army. But after the death of Lenin, there was a power struggle between Trotsky and Stalin prevailed. And Trotsky was exiled and subsequently killed by Stalin's henchmen in Mexico, where he had found refuge. Okay, these things become very, very important to understand when you're talking about the who are the neocons in America. You see, so yes, it was the bankers who did that. It was Germany who put Lenin and his comrades in a sealed train to go from Switzerland to Russia. The war was going on. And when the uprising happened, these people took leadership. Okay. So, what is the lesson in that? The lesson in that is the Western powers, particularly the bankers, the financial houses, they provided the money to the people within those countries or within those empires who were discontented with the situation and gave them the support, the most important support being the financial support and then the military support, that is armaments, to lead the revolution against the established power. Well, that's exactly what happened in 2014. Bankers, Democratic Party or Uniparty, leading a coup d'etat in Kiev to overthrow an elected government and then provide money to Zelensky, which is carrying on. Trump said that he'll finish the war within 24 hours after he comes to office. Well, it's 6 months now, right? He's only recently, a week ago, signed off another $300 billion dollars. All right. So this is bankers. So why are they doing that? That's the question. Well, I
Well,
said a little while ago that Russia is the richest country, resource-wise.
that kind of leads into the other topic. This dumpy little country north of the Caspian, no one's ever heard of, Azerbaijan. Why would they agree to get? First of all, what's going on? Like, why would Azerbaijan attack Iran? And it's also indirectly attacking Russia. Like they arrested their citizens.
Well, first thing I would ask, if I'm reading the news and it's all around me, I want to know the same question: why, and who's reporting this? You know, is this? By the way, I was in Azerbaijan in a conference, and I met, or rather, the conference was opened by the current president of Azerbaijan, Aliyev, whose father was Haider Aliyev, the president when there was Soviet Union, and he was a member of the Politburo, that is the commanding leadership, and now the son is the president. And I saw Azerbaijan as a remarkable country. I was in Baku for a week, and I thought it was the Paris of the East. It was just captivating. Baku, the Caspian Sea, is one of the first places where oil was discovered in industrial quantities, and Baku was built. This is in the early 1800s. That's one of the reasons there was a Crimean War in the 1850s by Britain to take away that part of the area because of the resources that was there. So I would want to know, and so my sense of it is that we are in a fog of war. What is a fog of war? That during the conflict that is ongoing or is taking place in the surrounding region or exactly with the people where the war, the conflict is centered, The noise is so great that you cannot separate the noise from the signal. You don't know what has happened. That's the fog of war. You see, a lot of it is deliberate, and a lot of it that is deliberate is disinformation, misinformation, exaggeration, elaboration, because all of this is part and parcel of warfare, especially modern warfare. You know, the second question to ask is why there is this conflict, and you go back to I will cite to you. I'm laying down the ground again to answer your question, so it's not I'm moving away. The famous, possibly the most famous European strategic thinker and a military man, a Prussian officer in the early years of the 19th century, the 1800s. He was a contemporary of Napoleon. The man's name was Clausewitz, Karl Clausewitz. And his most famous sentence in his book on strategy of war is war is simply politics by another mean. You cannot separate war from politics. In fact, politics is the mother of warfare. War is politics by another means. So what was the politics in this region? One has to ask, why did they go to war? So politics brings in the whole issue of economics, whole issue of demography, cultures, ambition of people, history, past history, and so on and so forth. Azerbaijan was created by carving up Iran, parts of Iran. For instance, Baluchistan on the eastern side of Iran has been carved up. Part of it is in Pakistan, part of it is in Iran, right? And it is the Baluchis connection from where the Afghan tribalist leaders were brought in to be the sleeper cells of the bankers of London and Wall Street, and in this case also Israel, that woke up or were activated on June the 13th, with the attack that happened. You see, from the inside, that is the
You believe
enemy.
it was the Baluchis? I did hear that the Mossad used Afghani citizens, nationals, but you're saying it's the Baluch, whatever people.
Well, the land area I'm talking about, they were Afghan Talibans or the Afghan fundamentalists, and that is the division in Islam between Shia and Sunni, and so these radical, fanatical Afghans, I mean, remember after 9/11, it was the Al Qaeda that was blamed. Osama bin Laden and 19 box cutters were blamed to bring down the World Trade Center. 25 years later, we know, or we should know by now. If people are still sleeping, that is their problem. We know that it was an inside job. It was not done by box cutters who could go and do this in the most advanced country in terms of technology and surveillance. And so that was a big question mark and 9/11, but now it is proven because it was Al Qaeda's deputy is now the president of Syria, and Donald Trump is embracing him and saying what a good man he is, a handsome young man, he's such a brave man, and same with the Israelis and so on and so forth, right? So same thing, Lenin, bankers war, Trotsky, bankers war. Then they become leaders and commissars, Marxist Leninists and so on and so forth, right? And that continued for 70 plus years later till Soviet Union was exhausted by the totalitarian system. Soviet Union being exhausted means the people of Soviet Union was exhausted, Russian people were exhausted, and so the whole thing collapsed. Nobody was there to defend it. Remember, a lie collapses. It can be pumped up and pumped up by lawyers and everybody else, and everybody believes in the lie. But eventually, when you take away the support system that keeps the lie floating, lies deflate and collapse. or lies become so weak that the other forces go into a conflict and destroys it. This is the cycle of history. So the propaganda since 1979 has been that the people of Iran do not have and do not give support to the Islamic Republic. That only a push, and where the push will come from the West, from the outside, only if a strong enough push is given to Iran, then the Iranian Republic will collapse. And once more, we will have the Shah back in power. His son is waiting to go back in power, right? Same idea in 1917. If you just give a push to Russia, Russia will collapse because it's so weak, so fragmented, it will collapse. And it did collapse, you know. But in 1991, 1992, nobody gave it a push. It collapsed on its own because it was built on basically inorganic connection of history. All right. So the assumption that a push in 2014 will bring about the defeat of Russia and the removal of Putin and so on and so forth. And that failed. That was an overreach. Now the question is, Azerbaijan, you're posing it. The conflict 2022 was the Ukraine war beginning, the SMO operation. 3 years later, 2025, is the war against Iran. But actual problem erupted. Actual means what was suppressed erupted in 2023 October with Hamas in Palestine, right? And that became a pretext for the Israelis to go on a rampage with Benjamin Netanyahu, a genocide and then the wars. Just as the crash of the World Trade Center became a pretext for America to go on a war, against, what was it called? The Great War on Terror. That was the label given by George Bush. And the first action was the Iraq War. Okay? Who was it who said that there will be 7 countries attacked and destroyed in 5 years? You remember Wesley Clark, who was the supreme commander of NATO forces, who was shown
Yeah.
the memo, and the list of the countries: Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, Libya, and Iran. So here we are. Instead of 5 years, it has taken 20 years for them to come to Iran, right? But the point is, all the other 6 countries have been effectively destroyed. It wasn't destroyed from within, it was destroyed from outside. All those 7 countries are relatively, resource-wise, were countries that could have done well for themselves. But the resource was wanted by the bankers and financiers for themselves. Now, let me pause here and I'll come back to Azerbaijan. I want to come back to Azerbaijan because it's so important. But let me pause here because I think there's a lot of confusion about why do they want resources. You see, money has to be backed up by collaterals, whether collaterals are special metals or natural resources. Once we went off the gold standard, that is, America went off the gold standard, then it had to be backed up by resources. So what was the resources from 1971 that the dollar was pegged to or attached to as a standard of measure? Petroleum, so petrodollars. And so while America has a lot of fossil fuel, a lot, maybe, as much as Saudi Arabia, they want to keep it for themselves, as in Canada. But the fossil fuel in Iran, fossil fuel in Saudi Arabia, fossil fuel in Persian Gulf, fossil fuel in Russia, etc., or Indonesia, and around the global south, they want to tap it in and control it. So that will be the collateral of the fiat money, that is money that is just printed without any backing. So this is the whole economic structure that one has to think about, and analyze. Of course, it'll take a lot of time for me to get into that, but I just wanted to put that on the table. That's why the global resources, which is so heavily in the global south, needs to be controlled, because that is what the bankers and the financiers, you know, base their calculation upon, and run the world. And while slavery may have been abolished, but slave labor has not been abolished, because we are all slave of the bankers, paying the interest, the usury. You see, everyone around, there's nobody. The bankers, they own everything. So this is at the heart of the struggle. So now comes the question of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is a very small little country that was created just as Armenia was created. Of course, the Armenian people go back in history. There was Armenia that was part of the Byzantine Empire, and before the Byzantine Empire, they were independent kingdoms. And it's one of the oldest settlement or people who embraced Christianity. Uh, so Armenia is there, the origin of Armenia in that region, attached to Turkey, uh, and the borders of Azerbaijan, and these were all part of the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union is gone. They are now independent state, and they have their rivalry and they have their conflict over land. In the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan, the conflict has been over Nakhchivan, a territory where their corridor has been now created, and so that uh, Azerbaijan can have access to the territory they claim on the other side of Nakhchivan, which is tied up with Armenia. So these are territorial dispute that goes back in historical time, and unless there's some mechanism to solve it among the two people, there will be conflict. But unlike Armenia, Azerbaijan is rich with the Caspian Sea resources, very rich. Okay, and it sits in a strategic location between the southern frontier of Russia in the Caucasus. That is where Georgia is, where Chechnya is, where Dagestan is. So that's the southern frontier of Russia, and that is the post 1992 Russia. During the Soviet period, they were all part of the Soviet Union, and then they broke up. Georgia broke up, and Armenia broke up, as Azerbaijan broke up, and so on and so forth. So it is this area that is strategically important for both Russia, for Iran as a Gulf state, and the proposition of constructing the north-south corridor between Moscow, St. Petersburg, Moscow, all the way down to Shahbar port and Bandar Abbas on the Persian Gulf. And that would then make this highway, this route, is part again also of the Belt and Road Initiative that the Chinese have been involved in. They will all connect. And the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has already, in terms of China and Iran, been completed. So the Chinese trains, and similarly Iranian trains, running from Xinjiang province, Urumqi, all the way to Bandar Abbas, can eliminate the tankers having to sail across the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, and up to China.
Professor Mansour, um, the audience might not know what you're talking about as well as you do. Would it be accurate to say that China doesn't want to deal with the American fleet for trade purposes? They'd rather go through Iran. Is that the strategic importance of Iran?
Well, it is again geography, geography, geography. I think I mentioned that to you the last time, that the whole idea of Eurasia, Eurasia, that the theory was put forward by the English geographer Halford Mackinder, that Eurasia is the heartland of the world, and the rest of the world is basically the rimland, particularly the island countries. If you look at the Americas, it is, two oceans, and so it is a rimland. You then look at the east, Australia, Indonesia, Japan. These are island countries, so it's a rimland. So the thesis is that who controls, and primarily England or Britain, who controls the Eurasian landmass will control the world. That was the Mackinder's theory. It was not a Chinese theory, it was not a Russian theory, it was not an Indian theory. But Britain was the world power at that time, 19th century. And so Britain, the theory was provided, and the British rulers, the bankers, the financiers wanted to control Eurasia. The first test of that came after the Napoleonic Wars with the Crimean War. Britain launched a Crimean War in partnership with the Ottoman Empire. Why did Britain and Ottoman Empire come together? Because Britain was financing the Ottoman Empire to block Russia from coming down into the Mediterranean, the stranglehold. With Again, I'm talking without maps, so your audience, you should have had a map here, and you could have pointed out, from the Black Sea there is the, the Strait of Dardanelles and Bosporus are the chokeholds, and if you block those straits, there's no access to the Mediterranean. So Turkey then becomes, in a strategic sense, an extremely important actor. And after World War One, well, there you have the map, and you can blow it up. Yeah, exactly.
Where am I going? Help me out
So
here.
you see the Black Sea. You see that's Turkey. And what is the Black Sea's connection to the Mediterranean? It is through. No, it is through. Yeah, yeah. There it is. That's the Strait of Bosporus and the Dardanelles. Bosporus is in the north, Dardanelles is in the south. Istanbul, you can see Istanbul, which used to be Constantinople, is the city at the chokehold. Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire in the east. Now it was the capital of the Ottoman Empire. And after World War One, the capital was moved to Ankara. So to control and stop the Russian from coming south into the Mediterranean Sea meant the Russian navy in Europe could not get into the open sea, because in the north they can be blocked both by the ice in the winter and by countries, Sweden, Norway, and so on, and in the south by Turkey. So the Belt and Road Initiative with the Chinese was to cut short the time. With the Russian, it is to have an alternative to using the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So if you can locate Moscow and then you draw your line down south,
Right?
yeah,
From there down to Iran.
down to Iran, that's right, alongside the Caspian Sea. So Azerbaijan is in the middle. And the story is that the Azeris are in alliance with Israel and America and Britain, the MI6, the CIA, and the Mossad have their hands filled. They're busy in trying to stir up the hornet's nest. And the Azeris have become complicit with the Western powers and Israel in the war against Iran, and is supporting Iran just as they supported Iran possibly, Israel possibly during the Iraq war. That's 2003. Now that is a narrative. On the other hand, only 10 days ago, the president of Iran, Pezeshkian, was in Azerbaijan on a summit for the regional summit of the countries, the small countries in that area. The Russians, Putin met with Aliyev. The traffic between Russia from the north is a historic relationship, and there is a expatriate population, Azeri population in Russia that has been operating there. Many of them are criminals, possibly smugglers, and so on and so forth. And so, in each society, there are elements of mafia who can be bought over with money. That was what the Russians have spoken about. In fact, they have arrested quite a few Azeri business people operating in Russia as suspects for what happened on June the 1st night when the Ukrainians and operated to attack the Russian nuclear triad, the bombers,
The
deep
strategic
inside
bombers.
the heart of Russia, right?
I'm glad you brought this up. I didn't know if you're much better than I am at knowing this stuff, but I didn't know you knew about that. So you have organized Azeri organized criminal elements. You call them businessmen. Maybe they are somewhat businessmen. The FSB, Russia suspects they had something to do with the Ukrainian strikes on their strategic bombers. Azerbaijan allows itself, it let in an English UK military attache, and then Mossad is getting in, and they're attacking Iran. This is in the middle of this Belt and Road Initiative. Russia's. I think Azerbaijan has made a huge miscalculation. I think they're going to be wedged between Iran and Russia.
Well, is it Aliyev and the Azeri government made a mistake, or is it simply the overreach of the criminal elements? Thinking they're playing with the Ukrainian. It is money, just as Uzbek and Tajiks have been caught in Ukraine, being used by Ukrainian intelligence and military operatives to do the attacks inside Russia. Because you see, all of these are former Soviet Union, and the people are competent in Russian language. They're moving around there, and so again, it's the multi-ethnic population, just as America is a multi-ethnic population. I mean, during the Biden administration, now the Trump administration, and going back to the previous Trump, there was a whole lot of noise about El Salvadorian MS-13 gangs, engaged, and the Mexican gangs that are engaged in all sorts of illegal activities, drug smuggling, and criminal operations. So this is something that happens by people who are involved in the underground, but it is also the underground is created by hostile countries. I mean, in the case of Iran, you have the Mujahideen Khalq that was after the 1979 revolution in a hostile relationship with the regime, and then they were driven out, and so they are based. The woman Rajavi's wife is based in France. The Mujahideen Khalq, their people are in the West. They were at one time declared a terrorist organization, but that declaration has been taken away, just as in the case of al-Shara in Syria now, Jabra al-Nusra. They are no longer. I mean, the $10 million reward on his head has been removed. He's now, a celebrated member. You can invite him to a G7 conference, and Mark Carney would be shaking hand with him. That he's a great diplomat and a politician, and so on and so forth. So this is the game of countries, games of power. So my sense about Azerbaijan is, as I've been trying to explain, that is the news in the Western press. So as I said, this is a fog of war. If evidence comes out from the Russian side and from the Iranian side that the Azerbaijan government was engaged in hostility, then the situation will dramatically change. You know the map as well as I do, and I hope your audience knows. Azerbaijan will be run over. Can you imagine a Mexican state or a Cuban state having a launch pad of operation, military operation against the United States, or somebody in Canada, somewhere in the mountains of British Columbia, or in the wastelands of Northwest Territories, operating out of there uh, for against America or Canada. Do you think they will get away with it?
I think it's a little bit risky because Turkey, Erdogan is so crazy and he's totally unreliable. He might pretend use it as a pretext to come help Azerbaijan. I think more likely Russia will just give sort of the green light for Armenia to start things again, and Iran will start more terrorist acts in Azerbaijan.
Yeah, but again, all of that is possibility. And coming back to Erdogan, yes, because the whole issue burst open with October 7th, right? The Palestinian issue has been simmering, and the Palestinian people have been paying the price of ethnic cleansing going all the way back to 1948 and before 1948. And the world has not given due, uh, you know, to the Palestinians what they deserve according to international law. So they burst out. And then that was the pretext for what has been happening since. It's a genocide in the 21st century in the face of the United Nations and all the treaties and all the agreements and all the convention. And we talked about it. Here's a Canada, a country that is so proud of being a founding member of the UN, and nobody speaks about it. And if anybody speaks about it, will be, penalized. There is no moral authority anymore in the West from the perspective of the Palestinian situation, which is now a global situation. So Turkey, yes, Turkey. See, these are all torn countries. Turkey was an empire, Ottoman Empire. What is an empire? Same with Iran. Same with India. Empire is not made up of a nation state, one people with one language and a nation state, right? Many ethnicities. So in the case of Turkey, Turkey ruled the Arab lands. Turkey ruled what is Kurdistan, so the Kurdish people. Turkey ruled Europeans, all the way into Serbia, Croatia, Bulgaria, and so on and so forth, till they were defeated and pushed back, right? So it's an empire, but the rulers of the empire, that is the majority of the people of the empire, have a certain view about themselves. As I said, civilizational states, they have a certain view about themselves. And their strategic location gives them the room to operate. Nation, countries, states, they are run by interest. Politics is about interest. What did Jesus say? My kingdom is not of this world. For the Christian, I'm saying that. What about for Prophet Muhammad in terms of Islam? He was not born to create an empire. His message was not an empire. You open the Quran and you go from chapter 1 to chapter 114, that's Surah 1 to Surah 114. There's no reference to the empire. That, I'm sending you, God is sending you to build an empire. So empires is a political project. So what I'm trying to say is Turkey has its interest. It is a country of something like 90 million people, as is Iran. But it is a torn country in the sense that are all these other internal conflicts. The major internal conflict in Turkey of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk after World War I is the conflict between the Turks and the Kurds. The Kurds want to be recognized and have their own language and so on and so forth. And the Turks say, no, you are Turkish. See, it's the same problem in Canada, French and English. 20% of the French, before they became bilingual and bicultural country, Canada, 20% said, no, we have had enough. We want to have our own state, a French state in North America. We had an uprising. War Measures Act was used against them. I don't think we have solved the problem, but at least we are peaceful now. because the people, the French people, know that they cannot fight and win a state of themselves. But what has happened is, in the political calculation, the 20% of the people dominate the 80% of the people, that is the non-French people. Alberta cannot build a pipeline across Canada because of the 20%. If it was a democracy in the sense the majority vote counts, then how can 20% control 80%? See, none of these things are discussed in the political arena, because if you discuss them, then you become a bad guy. So Turkey is a torn country in that sense. Iran has its own ethnic fractions, but it is now a state. And a state only functions when there is a controlling authority, otherwise it will splinter. Same thing with Russia, same thing with China, and same thing with the European states. I mean, how long the European Union is going to last is a big question mark. The interest of Spain is not the same as the interest of Germany. All of this is now resurfacing because of the energy crisis, because of inflation, because of resource factors. So Azerbaijan's is the Azeris themselves know where which side of the bread is buttered. Can they survive by becoming a tool of the Israelis? It's nothing to do with anti-Semitism, which is what is the propaganda argument. It's simple calculation. Look at the map, look at the people, look at the history. The majority of the Israelis are European transplanted into West Asia. They have no historical root. They, regardless of their constantly arguing, we have a 3,000-year history. Well, the Iranians have a 5,000-year history. So what are you talking about? 3,000-year history. And in that 3,000 years, you never had a presence in West Asia because the Romans basically expelled you. And that was in 70 AD, right? I mean, so as I said, the opening, these are historical problems. And people have to deal with historical problem in a manner in which both sides can come out. You're a businessman. What was two businessmen want to do? They can have conflict on the market, but they both want to come out winners, win-win, not a zero-sum situation, right? That needs diplomacy, that needs understanding, that needs empathy, that means respect to each other. So Azaris, from my point of view, taking all of these factors in, know which side of the bread is buttered. I have some sense of that because I traveled through that area. I met with people. I listened to them. The Azaris are very, religious people. I went on Friday and said my prayers with them, the people with whom I was interacting. So, and they're not removed from Iran, but they are an independent state. They wouldn't want to be absorbed into Iran. Neither would they want to be absorbed into Russia. The Israelis are simply using them. But to what extent have Azeris allowed themselves to be used is in the fog of war, lot of misinformation. Because Azeris would not want to be sanctioned by the Americans. The moment you talk, sanction, sanction, sanction. Its major economy is resource economy. So it has to sell its resources.
So, Professor Mansour, I guess to wrap up the episode,
Sure.
what do you think? What do you think is going to happen? Do you think the global north is basically lost? The BRICS are going to win? What's your prediction?
No, it's not. It's not a zero-sum game. What it is that these wars are the last or the penultimate conflict on the part of the Western powers trying to hold on to what they came to take as their over the last 500 years. It's like a man who's sitting on a property and all the documents of the property is not in his name. But the other side doesn't know till they go digging into the history and find out, we have the right to this property. And so now there's a conflict. So one side has the possession, the other side has the documents that those possessions were taken away from them. So it either will lead to a physical conflict or it will be settled in some form or the other. I haven't touched on economic because I've been saying all these are bankers' war. Only a couple of days ago, a week ago, Trump had his new budget that was passed through the Congress. If anybody looks at the numbers, I had just taken a brief glance. The American economy is hemorrhaging. The American debt, total debt, as you and I are speaking, is $37 trillion. Okay. To service that debt annually takes more than $1 trillion. The budget is about $10 trillion. And in that $10 trillion, more than 75% of the money is already allocated. It cannot be touched. Where do those money go? Defense, $1 trillion. Entitlements, $3 trillion. It is stuck there. Debt servicing, over $1 trillion. And then the rest. You know, how does it finance itself? It finances itself by selling its debt to other countries. That is, the treasury bills and the stocks and bonds. So other countries invest by buying those treasury bills. That is their investment. Bankers don't allow, or the government is run by the bankers, the Secretary of Treasury, and so on and so forth. They won't let the money sit there in the bank. They have to move it and mobilize it. So Trump comes along and he says, because he has to find a way to narrow the gap between the revenue and the deficit, with the debts mounting. According to the Congressional Budget Office report that runs the annual report on this, the most recent report that I took a look at very briefly is that if at this rate America keeps going without balancing the budget and then paying down the deficit debt incrementally, then in the next 20 years, 2050, the American debt will exceed $120 trillion.
Professor Mansour, this concept of debt, um, if you and I take out a loan, we have to pay back that loan. If we have a credit card, we have to pay off the debt eventually. There's this sense that with sovereign debt, you never have to really pay it back. It's just there. That's the problem I encounter.
You are right. It is there and it is assumed there, and so nobody wants to pay attention to it. But there is a reckoning because you have to keep financing your annual expenditure. The sovereign debt, as I just now mentioned, by the calculation of the Congressional Budget Office, will exceed $120 trillion. All right, so it has to be financed. Nobody's saying that America will have $120 trillion when its GDP is around about $27 trillion annual GDP. And that was in terms of dollar value, the number one economy in America. But we talked about it. I pointed out last week to you the purchasing power parity, which is the more realistic basis of calculation. China now surpasses America. China is number one country. On the basis of dollar, Canada is the 10th largest economy in the world. On the basis of PPP, it is at the bottom of the 20 largest economy in the world. Right? So, yeah, I mean, one has to produce to be able to consume and spend. But if you don't produce, then what are you doing? You are financializing the economy. Nobody is going to buy the debt of Bangladesh or of Sri Lanka or Papua New Guinea. But the American debt is a commodity now. It is sold in the international market, and countries buy it as an investment because they're getting interest on it. So when what I was going on to say, that Trump says that he's going to change the whole situation by bringing in tariff, and the money will flow, and America will have a golden age. That's his words, right? So he slammed a tariff, on China, and you know what happened. It he slammed it. 145 was the opening bid, I suppose, and then he started slicing it down because he suddenly realized, or somebody told him, "Sir, your shops will go empty, your warehouses will go empty, your supply chain it will become non-existent, and etc., etc., etc." So he started slicing it down. China didn't blink. I'm just talking about China, because the whole argument was that China has a trade surplus of something like $500 billion annually over America. What is not told in this discussion, the $500 billion trade surplus of China with America is then counterbalanced by China holding more than $1 trillion worth of American Treasury bill. So if you want to balance the trade side of 500 billion by slapping tariffs, China stops trading with you and then starts unloading the Treasury bills. Then what happens to America's debt? And it's not China, it's Japan, it's South Korea, and all the other countries, around the world. So what sort of thinking this is? The sort of thinking this is that I will threaten you with a gun, and if you don't buy my product, I will blow your head off. So still, who's going to buy your product? Right? CNN reported last week that the book came out, and the video, also the audio, the authors had the audio of President Trump's conversation, the readout and the audio with Putin and Xi Jinping, president of Russia and president of China. And the readout was, as reported, that President spoke with Putin and told him, in effect, that if you don't end this war and come to an agreement on ceasefire, then I will bomb Moscow.
What?
And yeah, I will bomb Moscow, and you better be aware of it. And Putin said that you are joking, and he said, no, I will bomb Moscow. And then after the conversation, he told the people, his people, that if Putin believes even 10% of what I've told him, he will listen to me. This is the madman theory that he is applying. That if you don't go along with me, then I will do something to you, threaten you. Then what do? You go along with me, or you at least attempt to go along. He said the same thing to Xi Jinping. I will bomb you. I'll bomb Beijing. So this is what Trump is doing. Tariff, bomb you, is the gunboat diplomacy of the 19th century, the 18th century. It cannot be the rational policy of the 21st century, especially of the nuclear age, and with countries that are peer countries in terms of nuclear power. But that's what Trump said. It's on the record. Okay, so what is happening is that the process of Trump also said that those countries who get out of the dollar economy, petrol, I will punish them. So the de-dollarization process is going to rapidly increase. This is already increasing. That means trade between the BRIC countries will not be based on dollar. It's already happening. The Chinese-Russian trade, the Indian, Russian, Chinese trade, the Iranian Russian trade. These are all happening based upon bilateral currency, not through the dollar, which in other words mean the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States and the City of London will not be then selling their dollars to these countries because dollar was and still remains the major currency of exchange, right? As I explained to you, if I want to trade with you and you want to trade with me, I don't take your currency and you don't take my currency. I have to go and with my currency convert it into dollar and then give it to you, and you do the same, right? So this is process is going to accelerate and is accelerating. So as you wrap up, if you want to come back, we can talk about it. What is Canada's foreign policy? What is Canada's national interest? Do we have one? Because nobody has discussed it, at least in public. We don't know. Justin Trudeau didn't do it for the 10 years. Stephen Harper didn't do it for the 10 years. They all were following World Economic Forum policy. And Mark Carney is a World Economic Forum man.
Yeah, it seems like he's following the WEF right into Europe.
Yeah. So that is, I mean, his whole approach is we'll join EU. Well, World Economic Forum, right? How long that will be sustainable in the North American context? These
I
are
guess.
huge question, and it is for your generation, particularly the generation that are working now, that are coming out of the school, like my children, and others. It's a huge question. But the majority of the people have no clue, and the politicians themselves have no clue because they simply read a script that is given to them.
I guess we'll have to save. We were supposed to cover that today, but we went into a lot of detail,
Sure.
so we'll save it for another episode. Professor Mansour, that was good. 90 minutes, and I wanted to thank you again for coming on. This is the third episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Payman. It is a pleasure.
Pleasure was all mine. Take care.